Hopefully you had a good weekend and are excited to join this virtual conference. I would first like to thank Interrel for arranging this virtual conference during these crazy days. So with that, let me introduce myself. My name is Rajesh Wajge. I'm based in California. I lead our analytics group at Keste. And with me, we have Vijay Sagar, who is the solution engineer. We both worked on this project for a customer recently and would love to share our experiences with you. Hopefully they will help you in some regard. But before that, quickly about Keste. We are based in Texas. We are a 16-year-old company specializing on campaign to cash processes and implementations. Everything starting ERP, CPQ, CRM, cloud integration, everything in between. We have deep expertise in all these technologies, all these areas. Our main strength is being able to work on the different tiers. So we are full stack partners. That means starting from hardware to technology to apps. And by virtue of that, we often work on complex implementations, complex problems, and that's our specialty. It's not just implementing enterprise solutions, but tackle those difficult to solve problems that often derail many customers or many projects and cause you a lot of heartburn. Some of the industries we specialize in are manufacturing, high-tech, finance, and retail. We have literally tens and hundreds of projects that we have done in these verticals. About our advanced analytics practice, our approach is we start with a business use case. That means asking questions like, hey, have you considered AI as a part of your digital transformation? Has the revenue recognition been a difficult problem for you, particularly because of the subscription billing, cloud, SaaS model, and so on and so forth? How could we help you track maintenance problems or collection or renewals problems before they become really problems? So how can you do that in a proactive fashion? So we typically talk to our customers and start having those type of conversations. And then we take into considerations the IT requirements, the modern day features in terms of predictions, agility, the fact that more and more users want the self-service capability, whereas they don't want to talk to the IT or rely on IT to help them serve their own needs. So they want the ability to import data sources and blend those into the standard data sources that are made available and create their own reports and analytics. Of course, embedded analytics is becoming more and more popular, and the real-time need to have this reporting and analytics at your fingertips has become very important. And when we do that, we offer end-to-end consulting services, starting with the data strategy we talked about, the importance of having a single source of truth, having worked with many enterprise systems and being partnered with Oracle, Salesforce, Amazon, and many other partners, we understand how these enterprise solutions work, as well as when we see any opportunities for master data management and robotic process automation, we work with our customer to deliver that value to them. Then coming to the core analytics areas, we have deep understanding and expertise, having worked with hundreds of clients in the data warehouse and BI arenas. And some of the tools that we have used quite extensively, those are listed here. But in general, our approach is technology agnostic or even the platform agnostic. As I said, we start with the business use cases, blend in the IT requirements, and whichever tool is preferable to the client, we use that tool. Importantly, more and more companies are looking into AI, ML, predictive capabilities, and that's also our specialty. Some of the tools, again, are mentioned here, mainly Salesforce and Amazon and Oracle but we have experience in all those tools to deliver that value to our customer. More and more, what's happening is that the problem is in how to articulate the business problem, and then use this technology to derive the solution. So that's what our strength is. But now enough about Keste. Let's talk about today's use case. First, we'll go over that. We'll highlight what the uniqueness of the solution was, the lessons we learned, and finally, we'll see what the takeaways are. So this customer was a multi-billion-dollar multinational company with more than 11,000 analytics users. So scale was humongous. And they wanted to move from on-prem OBIE and Essbase to cloud. So that was essentially the problem statement. They decided to go with lift and shift technology as opposed to migration. So it may appear that it's relatively simpler. You may not run into that many data issues. But guess what? There are always data issues and on-prem versus cloud challenges because of the inherent gaps between those two. So we'll talk about that. And to go into the solution and all those technical details at length, I have my colleague, Vijay Sagar. Vijay, over to you.
Thank you, Rajesh. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful introduction to the project and our agenda for today. My name is Vijay, and I'm a solution engineer over at Keste, and I'm going to walk us through some of the details of the lift and shift project before handing it back to Rajesh at the end so we can summarize our experience and recap some of the lessons learned. So what we're seeing on screen right now is a high level and highly simplified application flow for the solution as it stands right now. And this is after we have gone through multiple iterations with changes and improvements made as a result of many discussions with the customers reporting and security teams, as well as multiple teams from Oracle. So let's briefly explore this diagram before we proceed, as having a good understanding of the high-level solution will allow one better insight into what we'll be discussing later in the presentation. So let's dive in, shall we? So first of all, I'd like to draw attention to the fact that the diagram that we're seeing on screen right now is divided into two halves. You'll see the public subnet on the right, and you'll see the private subnet on the left. And this refers to the endpoints for those particular subcomponents. And you can see the subcomponents are laid out on the screen. So on the right, you'll see a component called the Oracle Services Network. And for the sake of simplicity, what that's doing in our case is it's standing as a placeholder for both the customer's OCI tenancy, so Oracle Cloud Infrastructure tenancy, as well as their OAC instance. So that's our consuming component, if you will. So that's why it's the main focus of our discussion today. And what you'll see is that all of the subcomponents other than that are basically data sources that will be consumed by OAC most often. And so it's almost arranged in a sort of daisy wheel pattern around it. So all of these will be sending data to OAC so that OAC can display it, right? So a typical analytics flow, 80% of the time is going to involve a user logging in to the OAC instance. They'll be authenticated against IDCS, which is Oracle's Identity Cloud Services. So once they're authorized and authenticated, what will happen is they'll go ahead and proceed to open a dashboard or a report. When that happens, OAC then communicates with these subsystems, source systems, if you will, and data is retrieved. You'll see that there are basically three different types of sources shown on screen. You'll see the Essbase on top. You'll see two Oracle databases. One of them is in the OCI Classic environment, and the second one is in the OCI Gen 2 environment. Now, these are the same Oracle database, but what we're going to talk about later in this presentation is the fact that the customer had a parallel project that was migrating their Oracle database from OCI Classic to OCI Gen 2, and this happened mid-project. And so we will talk about how we structured our side of things to work with this change in the database source. So you'll see that the connections to these are named pre-migration and post-migration. The migration here refers to the migration of the Oracle database from OCI Classic to OCI Gen 2. Please note that at the bottom of the diagram on the left, we have also placed the RDG, the Remote Data Gateway. Now that's a new component for us, and we'll be talking about why that was used as well. Next slide, Rajesh. So now that that's the high-level overview is out of the way, let's talk about some of the features or asks of the solution that we think were interesting and out of the ordinary for this type of lift and shift. As a result of these unique things, we built quite a few POCs, especially our infrastructure team, but also the application teams, and we'll talk about those POCs as well. Custom vanity URL. So the customer has a very large number of Essbase users who primarily access it through SmartView. The ask from the customer's end was to reuse a SmartView URL that they already used in their on-prem system. This was done so as to try and minimize the training and troubleshooting that would otherwise be required with a URL switch. So this was an opportunity for us to get started with a POC. We were able to quickly put together one to check two things. One of them is if the redirection would work, if we could actually use a custom vanity URL. So that would be the same thing that they're using, so there would be no change on their end. And B, if it would actually be able to retrieve the applications or cubes from the Essbase instance and show it. The former was actually pretty simple. The latter took a little bit of digging around, but with setting some of the parameters with the right values, we were eventually able to prove that this is a workable solution with no major caveats. This solution was then implemented and given over to the customer, and the customer was pretty happy with the fact that they didn't have to go back and retrain their users to work with a new URL. And if you remember, they have a lot of users. So I believe they have about 9,500 Essbase users. I'm not really sure how many of them use SmartView primarily, but that's where we're at. Next slide. So Waff for enhanced security. During our discussion with the customer, it quickly became apparent that security was crucial to their leadership. They had some reservations on publicly accessible elements and wanted enhanced security where possible. So one of the ways we did this was to test a Waff for enhanced security in front of the Essbase load balancer, which is kept in the public subnet. So we undertook another POC to test out adding this Waff in front of the load balancer and to make sure that the data connections were still working. And we will discuss this in more detail in our section on lessons learned. But we did implement a Waff, and there were about 650 rules that you can implement. And so we helped the customer define those rules. Next slide. Integration with third-party tools. The final unique aspect of this project was having to integrate with third-party tools that we didn't really know a lot about. So the client, what they do is they automate their script loading with a third-party tool, as well as they have some specialty dashboards that are also used with another third-party tool. So due to the aforementioned security requirements, which was a core part of what their ask was, the third-party tools could not natively communicate with the Essbase instance because the Essbase instance is within that private subnet. So in order to get this to work, what we did was we opened the relevant ports to enable communications. We had to switch the communication protocol from HTTPS to HTTP. And we were able to establish the connections needed through private IPs and fast connect. What this did was it bypassed the Waff and just worked behind the scenes. And so using fast connect, we were able to establish the connection between those third-party tools as well as Essbase. So once this connection was established, this was then handed over to the customer, and the customer has assumed ownership of these tools and the connection to Essbase, and now they're tweaking it to to suit their needs. Next slide. All right, so moving on to the lessons learned. So in a project like this, with a lot of moving components and complex interactivity between them, it's important to plan ahead and document everything. Not only is security a core aspect of what we did during this project, it was also very important for the various teams, such as the infrastructure team, the OAC team, the Essbase team in our case, to understand the requirements of other teams and other components, and documentation and planning played a key role in achieving this. For example, on top of the fact that security considerations meant that we had to carefully plan where the components would reside, and based on those changes, the communication channels or methods by which they would talk to one another would change. We also had to prepare for a mid-project database source shift. And we spoke a little bit about this at the beginning. So in a sense, what happened is they have two sources. They have Essbase, and then they have an Oracle database. But for our project, we essentially had three sources. So the Essbase, an initial Oracle database residing in OCI Classic, and then a final Oracle database that was then moved to OCI Gen 2. So, so this means that we had to work with three different types of sources, and we had to simultaneously work with Oracle database that was in OCI Classic as well as OCI Gen 2. So we had to set up both the communication channels between OCI Classic and OAC, as well as OCI Gen 2 and OAC. And both of these require two different types of communications because if you'll remember, the OCI Classic is in the public domain, whereas OCI Gen 2 is is in the private subnet. So all of this meant that OCI Classic could be accessed via the public internet. There would be strict IP whitelisting as the security rule there, whereas in the case of OCI Gen 2, we had a lot more security rules that we could set up, and we were able to use the RDG to make that connection between the OCI Gen 2 and Essbase and OAC. Next slide. All right, so dormant issues. We learned quickly in the project that things we took for granted could come back to bite us and cause delays. The classic example in our project was the migration of the non-prod OBIE instance to OAC. So creating the 11G export bundle and uploading it to the instance was something that we had done many times before without problems. And we expected that to be the case when we actually started working on the live system. But as a non-prod system was being prepped for the migration, a dangling user was introduced into their web catalog, which essentially threw a spanner into the works. And what that did was it stopped the 11G bundle from being imported. So the first thing we did was to naturally run the inbuilt validation utility. We ran this multiple times, as is the case, to incrementally try and fix the problems. And eventually we were able to get the utility to pass the web catalog as having a valid web catalog, but the 11G bundle would still not upload. So we had to work closely with the Oracle support team. We had to create an SR that was escalated because this is causing a delay for us. And we poured through a bunch of logs, and we had iterative solutions and workarounds given to us, and we tried all of those, and until we finally hit upon the root cause, which was this one particular dangling user left in the web catalog. So once that was removed by our team, the 11G bundle was uploaded without without errors. So the lesson here is that just test important features in advance, even those that are known to work well. So we had done this, and we should have done this instead of waiting for the time for the official kickoff. And had we done that, we would have caught this a little earlier. So what ended up happening was that it affected our timelines a little bit, and we had to catch up, which we did. But this is something we could have lived without. So that's our lessons learned. Next slide, please. All right. So I'm sure we've all heard this phrase in analytics before: do not pave the cow path. What that means here is that this is a great time for process improvements, right? Instead of just making this a lift and shift, which is like a web UI replacement project, we'd encourage customers and implementation partners to take a critical look or a critical relook at some of the processes and arrangements and customer habits within the old system. Just because something has been done one way in the past does not mean that this is how it should be done in the future. This is the perfect time for us to be making those changes that would otherwise meet with a lot of inertia from the groups and users and other teams involved. So, for example, the customer had manually added roles to their Essbase users over their life cycle. So this is a lot of people, and this is not something that we could have done in a short-term project such as this. So what we did was we encouraged them to follow the OAC model, divide their users into groups based on permissions and roles, and then move to using curl and taking advantage of Oracle's REST APIs to manage their users. So what we did was we wrote the programs for them. We had a little training session where we talked, where we walked the customer through some of the ways that they can use this, and the customer has taken this to heart, and they've gone ahead and they've changed the way they do things. And I think that this is one way by which, you can give a better solution, a more user-friendly solution to the customer. Next slide, please. So cloud security is critical. We have been talking about security all this time because it is really that important, right? So coming from an on-premise environment, the customer security team was historically used to enjoying a lot of control over their security. As they moved to the cloud, the loss of some of this granular control was almost a showstopper for them. So in order to understand the customer's requirements for the security sign-off for OAC, we had to first understand the security controls they had in place in their on-premise system. After comparing those with the standard out-of-the-box security features in OAC, the following decisions were made. So components that could be placed in a VCN were placed in VCN. We added a Waff if there was any place where it was a publicly accessible point. So if you'll remember from the diagram, it was on the Essbase load balancer. Also, there was strict IP whitelisting where needed. So for example, let me talk about a little interesting point here. So the customer was using the Oracle database that was in their OCI Classic, right? And this was being accessed by their on-premise OBIE EE system. So they had strict IP whitelisting, and they had only allowed access to their scan IP, so 3 of them coming in from their OBIE EE. So when this moved from OBIE EE to OAC, it so transpired that we had to open the IP whitelist for the region-specific gateway. Now, this was something that the client or the customer was not very comfortable with, because it is possible that there are other tenants who might have the same gateway IPs. So we worked with the customer, and we came up with a solution where we started using a combination of both the IP as well as the user name that's accessing the database. So you had a combination of IP address as well as username, and this combination would be unique. So even if the gateway IP was the same, the username would be something that was very unique to the customer, and there was not really a chance of that being repeated. Plus, another thing to note here was that this was a very temporary, almost vaporware, if you will, because the database shift happened halfway through the project. So it was only for that initial testing that they needed this. So this was so finally the security team on the customer side did give us that sign off, and we were able to continue with the project. Next slide. So here's the RDG ready for prime time. So as we started this project, the focus was on using the RDC to connect between OAC and Essbase. But with the security discussions making material changes to the architecture of the solution, specifically sending the Essbase instance to a private subnet meant that the RDC was no longer an option. Couple that with the fact that RDG is the preferred option when connecting using the RPD, it was a logical option to take. So the customer right now, what they're doing is they're moving, as you know, from OBIE to OAC. They're not really focusing on the data visualization aspect. That's something that they want to look at later down the line once they become more comfortable with OAC and all of its features. So for the time being, their focus is on the CAN reports and their OBIE 11G reports that have been lifted and shifted into OAC, and all of that is using the RPD. So the RPD is the main way of communication, and Oracle's preferred method for this situation is to use the RDG. The fact that OAC 5.8 was released in between our project was very opportune for us. So the RDG, the remote data gateway, is generally available as of 5.8. So this came at the perfect time for us. So since this was a new component for us, so what we did was we took this as an opportunity to create a POC to make sure that the RDG connection works, to thoroughly test it, and to make sure that it is ready for a live system, and to make sure that it works with our requirements. And with thorough testing and all of our work on it, I think we can say that the RDG works fine for us, and it's working as we expect. Next slide. All right, so Oracle Analytics Cloud is not the same as OBIEE. I think that Oracle has done a great job of lifting and shifting most of OBIEE functionality to OAC, especially considering the fact that OAC is a PaaS system. One of the differences that we found was in the way OAC displays a web page on a browser. So some of the HTML elements have had minor tweaks to the names. For example, what was originally referred to as header top bar is now referred to as master branding area header top bar. So what this meant is that any JavaScript that references these visual elements had to be rewritten. So we were asked by the customer to take a look. At the initial testing, it was apparent that none of the JavaScripts were working. So we had to go in and figure out what was going on. We quickly realized that there were small changes to the names, and that's why the JavaScripts were not working. So our team went in, picked all the JavaScripts that were available, parsed through them to make sure if they were referencing any of these display elements that were changed, that we found out what those names are in the new OAC system. And this was basically a matter of going in, inspecting the element in Chrome, understanding what these display elements are called now in OAC, going back and replacing the references to this in the JavaScript, and then testing the JavaScripts to make sure that they were working. We did this, we changed all the JavaScripts, and they're all working right now. And so that's something that we need to keep in mind. Another thing is the folder structure that we're all used to from OBIEE is not really available in OAC. So some custom images and logos will have some issues. For example, when you upload the 11G bundle from OBIEE to OAC, what will happen is you'll see that all of the reports and dashboards work well. The data comes through as expected, but the images and any custom logos will not be available. You will have to re-upload these so that they will then be displayed. What we did notice was at some point of time, some of these images and logos got wiped out. So what our solution is to move these to a web server, an external web server, and to store them there, and to have references to these files instead of having the file directly uploaded into OAC. So in the case of a similar wipe in the future, it would be a simple matter of taking the backed up web catalog, and we have a weekly backup strategy in place for the customer, and just re-upload this web catalog back into OAC and have those references come back without too much rework on the client side. So that's that. And then the final thing I'd like to talk about is not all style configuration settings are supported by OAC. And what that means is the customer in question had, over the course of their long association with OBIEE, that created a lot of customizations to their tables, their cache management, pagination, all of these things. And these were done by them either in the instance config or the NKS config files. And as you guess, these are now no longer available in OAC. What is available is a GUI called the system settings, where some of these settings can be tweaked. So what we had to do was map the available settings with what the customer had in their on-prem environment, and let them know what is available, what can be tweaked in OAC, and what is something that might become available in the future. It might be an enhancement request, but but it's not available right now. So those are some of the differences between OAC and OBIEE that we encountered. There are a few others, but these were the big ones for us. So that basically comes to the end of my part. I'm going to hand it back to Rajesh so you can summarize and recap this for all. Thank you, Rajesh.
Thank you, Vijay. So in the end, what really worked very well for us was planning, especially around these three components: security, data issues, and change management. Regarding security, we had kept aside a significant amount of time to go over those, knowing that this client was very sensitive to security requirements. But even then, we did at one point of time fell behind the project timeline by a couple of weeks because of the additional conversations around this. Fortunately, we were able to catch up. The second piece was data issues that Vijay elaborated regarding the dangling user. We literally spent hundreds of hours on that seemingly obvious, not obvious, but innocent issue. But fortunately, we were able to overcome that through proper planning. And I'll talk about the change management at the end. But before that, the key piece, the key aspects to remember here is that your design needs to take into account all the subcomponents as well as the security. And what I mean by that is if there are any other projects going on simultaneously, you need to be able to take the impact of those projects onto your project or vice versa into consideration. And all the implementations team needs to have clarity as to where the handshake is going to occur, where is the impact going to occur. And if you take that into consideration, then you can provide a very good experience to users. Speaking of users, it's very important to get your users involved early on so that they can see the differences in the behavior and functionality between on-prem and cloud. So that gives them a chance to get settled with what's coming next. And instead of introducing them to the new experience at the UAT stage, where they may come up with a valid viewpoint in terms of, hey, I'm not comfortable with, let's say, changing the URL and so on and so forth. So the sooner you get them involved, the more time you have to overcome their concerns and give them a much better experience. So that was that concludes our presentations. Next, we have about 10 minutes. We will take a look at the question and then try to address those. But if you cannot, please feel free to reach out to us. And thanks again for participating.